Good afternoon, everyone. Thank
Recording
you all.
in progress.
Thank you all for joining us for this talk by Professor Hamdani, who is is on the steering committee for a center, for a longtime member of the history department here, and actually a colleague of mine all the way back in graduate school in Princeton. So we've known each other since the very beginning of our careers. Professor Hamdani is doing beginning or in the middle of a really important project that she'll be presenting to us today. The focus of her research spans Islamic history, Shi'i thought, and women in Islam. And she actually co-founded and was the director of the Islamic Studies program here at George Mason. So today we're going to hear about Maritime Muslim, the Sulayhids in the Indian Ocean world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Dekig. So wonderful to be invited to present to the Center for Global Islamic Studies, and thank you for attending, those of you that are attending in person, and those on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. So I'm going to give a condensed presentation that is based on a book project that I've been working on for some time. And the book project is, in a nutshell, attempting to engage two fields, Indian Ocean Studies and the material in Indian Ocean Studies literature about Muslim merchants, and at the same time debates about cultural capital in Muslim communities held by religious elites. So regarding the Indian Ocean, forgive me, I'm going to read from a prepared text. So regarding the Indian Ocean, the presence in it of Muslim merchants has been acknowledged as far back as Ashim Das Gupta's archival study, Indian Merchants and the Decline of Surat, and Janet Abeloughad's Before European Hegemony. But Muslim merchants have largely been characterized as non-state actors in those studies. As for studies on Muslim religious elites, they have largely focused on Sunni rather than Shi'i religious elites. So, for example, I will come back to that previous slide, but a lot of the interest in Indian Ocean Studies has been based on the acknowledgement that Muslim merchants were quite active in Indian Ocean trade in the pre-modern period, as is apparent from this map. And those early studies looked at the presence of Muslim merchants in the Indian Ocean. So we have, for example, two seminal works by Ashim Das Gupta, pictured here, and also Janet Abeloughad's Before European Hegemony. So I would like to suggest that Muslim states were actually actively involved in sponsoring and facilitating maritime trade, and that for Shi'i religious authorities, cultural capital extended beyond knowledge of the Quran and Sharia. These are the two modest interventions that I'm hoping to make with my book. Toward that end, I'd like to focus in particular on the role played by a medieval Muslim state in Yemen, whose activities in the Indian Ocean led to the establishment of a small Shia Muslim community on the west coast of India, in Gujarat. That community has endured to the present. That community is known in India as the Bohra community, and more specifically, it belongs to the Dawoodi Tayyibi Ismaili variety of Shi'ism. So just briefly, as you can see from the slide, Shi'ism begins to kind of emerge in the 7th century. It develops in the 9th century. It branches off into a variety of Shi'isms, one of which is Ismaili Shi'ism, By the 12th century, a branch within that group becomes known as Tayyibi Ismailis, and by the 16th century, they are known as Bohras in India. So I'm dealing with the Bohra community and Bohra merchants and religious elites. So while scholarship occasionally mentions the presence of Bohra and other Muslim merchants in the Indian Ocean in earlier periods, it has for the most part presumed that these activities occurred without the active interest of hinterland states toward maritime commerce and activity, even while those states taxed and benefited from the trade that reached their shores. As Michael Pearson had argued, normally rulers did not care what merchants did. Thus, scholars have focused their attention on networks that developed outside of state oversight and investment. For example, among Jewish merchants in the medieval period, as reflected in the Geniza archives. One such study explores the role of Yemen in those networks. Another seminal study by Engseng Ho likewise focuses on Yemen to survey the movement of diasporic Muslim merchants from the Hadramaut in Yemen to Southeast Asia and back. I'm sorry, I probably should pause and explain some of these book covers. A Mediterranean Society, the two book covers to the left on the slide, refers to a multi-volume study conducted on the Jewish community, medieval Jewish community in Egypt and other parts of the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. We have also a study that focused on Yemen and the activity of Jewish merchants in Yemen, in Aden in particular, by Roxani Margheriti. And then we also have the work by Engseng Ho titled The Graves of Tarim. So this paper builds on the focus on Yemen, not only because its location in the Indian Ocean trade was clearly crucial as a link in networks that ranged across the Indian Ocean from Europe to China, but also because that importance was appreciated and acted upon by the 11th and 12th century Ismaili Shia Muslim dynasty of the Sulayhids. As I suggest here, the Sulayhids are an example of Muslim state investment in the Indian Ocean trade, thus leading us to reconsider assumptions about those states' disinterest in maritime matters. Their investment endured not only in the form of continuous trade connections between Yemen and India, but also the spread of a particular Shi'i Islam in the Indian Ocean that has received little attention in Indian Ocean scholarship. The Sulaihid dynasty was established by Ali bin Muhammad al-Sulayhi in 1047. At that time, Ismaili Shi'i Islam was the official doctrine of the Fatimid Caliphate, centered in Egypt. The dynasty that ruled were considered imams by the Ismaili faithful and caliphs to their non-Ismaili Muslim and non-Muslim subjects. In the 11th century, the Fatimids were seemingly at the peak of their power, their domains extending from North Africa, where the dynasty initially came to power and vassals now held sway, to the eastern Mediterranean littoral, including the city of Jerusalem. They were also nominally in possession of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina on the west coast of Arabia or the Hejaz. Their rivals, the Abbasid Caliphate on the other hand, or the Abbasid Caliphs on the other hand, were by then barely in control of the immediate hinterland around their capital in Baghdad. As part of their strategy to capitalize on Abbasid weakness, the Fatimids sought not only to seize Baghdad itself, but also to secure control of the Yemen, which would enable them to link their presence in the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean, capturing trade there that the Abbasids had previously exploited from the Persian Gulf. The presence of Ismaili Shi'ism in Yemen actually dated as far back as the 9th century, since a foothold had first been established by agents or dais like Mansur al-Yemen and Ali bin al-Fadl. Their presence in Yemen allowed for the training of the agents able to propagate the Ismaili cause further afield. One such da'i, or agent, Abu Abdullah al-Shi'i, was able to convert to the cause a large tribal confederation of North Africa while they were on pilgrimage in Mecca. Their support enabled the establishment of the first iteration of the Fatimid Caliphate in 909 in Afriqiya, or North Africa. Yemen itself, however, had become the site of tribal competition, championing a variety of Islams along its shores and its mountainous hinterland. Nevertheless, with the backing and attention of the Fatimid Imam Caliphs in the 11th century, the training of promising Yemenis by agents from the Fatimid capital in Cairo, and the growing appreciation of Yemen's strategic location to Fatimid ambitions, it was possible to imagine the extension of Fatimid imperium to Yemen. It remained for a capable Yemeni to emerge. This, as it turned out, was Ali bin Muhammad al-Sulayhi. A convert to Ismaili Shi'ism, Ali al-Sulayhi had been active in propagating Ismaili Shi'ism in Yemen and the west coast of Arabia, or the Hijaz, as a pilgrimage leader from the 1030s, and because of this earned the title of da'i, or agent, for the Fatimids. But it was through his conquests, which encompassed for a time all of the Yemen as we know it today, that led to his being given recognition and support by the Fatimid Imam Caliph at the time, al-Mustansir, who reigned from 1036 to 1094. Ultimately, however, Ali al-Sulayhi's conquests earned the enmity of the Zaydi Imam to the north of Sana'a, which Ali al-Sulayhi had conquered for his capital, and the Najahid dynasty to the south of the Hamdan tribal lands in central Yemen that had supported al-Sulayhi. As a result, his son and successor, al-Mukarram Ahmad, found himself with the task of reconquering many of the territories brought under Sulayhid control by his father. Al-Mukarram Ahmad was eventually incapacitated by battle injuries after 1074. This brought to the fore his wife and successor Arwa, also known as Al-Sayyida al-Hurra or Al-Malika al-Hurra or Al-Sayyida al-Malika, who ruled Yemen until her death over 60 years later in 1138. The contemporary historian Almada relates that she was born in the year 1052, and Asma, daughter of Shihab, superintended her education. In her personal appearance, Sayyida was of fair complexion, tinged with red, tall, well-proportioned, but inclined to stoutness, perfect in beauty, of a clear-sounding voice, well-read, and a skillful writer. Her memory stored with history, with poetry, and with the chronology of past times. Nothing could surpass the interlinear glosses upon both verbal construction and interpretation inserted in her handwriting on the pages of books. I have heard more than one aged man among the natives of Dhu Jibla, the capital that she built, affirmed that as-Sulayhi, her father-in-law Ali, treated Sayyida in her earliest years with a degree of deference he showed no other person. "Show her respect," he used to say, "for by Allah she will be the preserver of our race and the guardian of our crown unto whoever endures of our dynasty." Almada adds about the capital that she built, Jibla was the name of a Jew who sold pottery on the spot where the first royal palace was afterwards built, and the city was named after him, indicating the presence and role of Jews in Yemeni as well as Egyptian society that the Geniza documents that other authors, for example, who have used, reflecting the importance of Jews in Yemeni and Egyptian society that Geniza documents also indicate, as per the scholarship of authors I mentioned earlier. It is important to note from Almada's description of Arwa and the events of her reign that she was educated at the hands of her mother-in-law Asma, no less, and that her education clearly provided her with credible authority as the head of a new religious sect. Perhaps also as interesting are comments about her physical appearance, indicating a public persona that belies the assumption about the seclusion of elite women in this period of Islamic history. Like the dynasty's founder, Ali al-Sulayhi, Al-Mukarram Ahmad and Arwa were recognized as rulers and dais by their Fatimid Imam Caliph overlords. A series of Fatimid sijilat, or decrees, issued from the time of Al-Mustansir to that of his successor Al-Musta'li, who died in 1101, and his successor in turn, Al-Amir, who died in 1130, confer the title of Dai on all three members of the dynasty. These decrees and other correspondence from the Fatimid center were issued as well by members of the Imam Caliph's families and senior Dais, most famous among them Al-Mu'ayyad Fiddin al-Shirazi, who was the one who initially drew Fatimid attention to Yemen, and also, more famously perhaps, realized the declaration in favor of the Fatimids in the Abbasid capital of Baghdad during the Basasiri affair. Moreover, two decrees in particular, in 1075 and in 1089, explicitly conferred jurisdiction of both Al-Mukarram Ahmad and Arwa, and then Arwa alone, over the Ismaili Dawa further east in Oman and India, and over its trade. Evidently, this was due to the revenue that historically arrived to Yemen from these regions, as noted by the contemporary historian Almada and the 15th century Ismaili Yemeni historian Idris Ahmad ad-Din. Both mention revenue that Arwa obtained from the port of Aden, which had been gifted to her by her father-in-law Ali al-Sulayhi, and then lost when Aden's vassals broke with Arwa over a succession crisis at the Fatimid center. According to Almada, the yearly revenue received from the port of Aden amounted to some 100,000 dinars. Additionally, Sulayhid investment in Indian Ocean trade is reflected in the establishment of a Rais al-Tujjar, or head of merchants, at a Matjar Sultani, or official commerce bureau, in Sulayhid, Yemen. The succession crisis in Arwa's time in fact led to an important development, the establishment of a new Dawa, or branch of Ismaili Shi'ism by Arwa after 1130. The death in that year of the Fatimid Caliph Al-Amir led to court maneuvers that bypassed the succession of his infant son Al-Tayyib. Arwa declared in favor of Al-Tayyib and thus broke with the Fatimid center, establishing a new Dawa for which she appointed a new hierarchy of Dais. This singular and unprecedented action by a woman in Islamic history was to not only inaugurate a new branch of Ismaili Shi'ism, but also a new exclusive relationship between Yemen and India for the now Tayyibi Ismaili community. In the surmises of scholars as to why Arwa broke with the Fatimid Caliphate, itself in its last decades by that time, local and global factors are cited. Local factors included the inability of the Sulayhids and their supporters to best the unremitting tribal rebellions against them, the return to the fray of the previously defeated Najahids, who ruled the coast of Yemen, who incidentally also had benefited from an Indian sojourn while they were under control by the Sulayhids, and the determination of new leadership among the Zaydis to press their advantage against the Sulayhids in the taking of Sana'a, for example. As well, Fatimid Imam Caliphs who succeeded Al-Amir attempted to lure away Sulayhid vassals in Aden. As for global factors, the instability of the Fatimid state itself no doubt figured in Arwa's calculations, as well as the importance of the Indian community and its merchants. We know from Fatimid decrees at the time of Al-Mustansir the names of two Dais that were sent to Gujarat beginning in 1067, Abdullah and Marzuban. Bohra historians attribute to them the conversion of a trading caste in Gujarat, Vohra, hence Bohra, to Ismaili Shi'ism based on miracles and the miraculous conversions of a peasant couple, as well as a vizier to a local Raja and then the Raja himself. Legendary accounts aside, there does seem to be hard evidence of the success of the dyes sent to India in converting segments of the population of Gujarat in the form of a 12th century mosque and mausoleum complex in the village of Badreswar in the Kutch district of Gujarat, only a short distance inland from the shores of the Arabian Sea. You know, I want to stop because I've been missing my own cues to forward some slides that might help to illustrate some of the things I've been talking about. So we have a map of the Fatimid Caliphate at the height of its power in the 11th century. An image of the Yemeni highlands that Ali al-Sulayhi was able to not only propagate Ismaili Shiism but also to conquer. The capital of Sana'a, a city which he made his capital and then was taken from him later by the Zaydis. The capital that Arwa built in Jibla, which is in the central portion of Yemen. A tomb mausoleum complex of Arwa, or for Arwa, that remains to this day. Here is a map of Gujarat and the area around this mosque mausoleum complex of the 12th century in Badreshwar is located. So, first described in an archaeological survey during the colonial period, this mosque mausoleum complex was later studied by Z.A. Desai in 1965, who proposed 1159 or 1160 as the dating of the mosque and mausoleum, and identified the surviving inscriptions as Kufic in the Fatimid style. Mehrdad Shukuhi later investigated the wording of the inscriptions and discovered references to the Ahlul Bayt as well as an unknown individual, thus indicating for him a connection in both style and substance to the presence of an Ismaili community. At the same time, a Jain chronicle of this period mentions a mosque built at this time for the Ismaili trading community of the town. Thus, we have evidence not only of an enduring Ismaili presence in Gujarat from the 12th century, but one that seems to bear the imprint of official sponsorship. At the other end of the Indian Ocean, a similar study by Michael Muirbar of inscriptions of a church called Ulkro Cherkos in the Ethiopian highlands has revealed Kufic inscriptions and architectural features that clearly resemble those of both the Fatimid center and replicate features of Arwa's mosque in Yemen. As well, funerary stelae off the coast and the Dahlak archipelago bear Yemeni surnames and Ismaili Shia confessions in their inscriptions. This evidence suggests to Muehlbauer an official Sulaihid effort to extend and connect trade from Yemen to East Africa and thence to Fatimid Egypt. The demise of the Sulayhids with the death of Arwa in 1138, however, did not lead to the decline of Yemen's importance to Indian Ocean trade, as evidenced by the continuing efforts of successors to the Fatimids in Egypt to control Yemen. Having established Yemen's geostrategic importance, the Fatimids having established Yemen's geostrategic importance, subsequent Egyptian dynasties like the Ayyubid dynasty, which you'll see pictured here. I'm trying to cram a whole bunch of maps of Yemen in different eras onto one slide. So to the far left of the screen is Yemen, when it was part of the Ayyubid dynasty that succeeded the Fatimids in Egypt. We also have a map of the Rasulid dynasty, which was a vassal of the Mamluks, and their control of Yemen in this sort of yellow area. So here's the Ayyubid control of Yemen. Here's the Mamluk control of Yemen through their vassals, the Rasulids. Later on, the Tahirids controlled this area of Yemen. And then, of course, the Ottomans conquered Yemen somewhere between 1530 and the 1560s. And their control of Yemen is visible in this small inset right here at the bottom. So Yemen remains important to a variety of different dynasties, ranging from the medieval to the early modern period. And in conquering Yemen, the Ottoman dynasty initiated the entramelment of that region, of that country, in the great power politics of the modern period, which has arguably lasted and devastated Yemen to date. From the early modern period, or 15th century, European archives become a fraught, if necessary, means of gaining information about trade in the Indian Ocean. To the rare extent that Europeans identified Indian merchants they competed with, or who supplied them with the stuff of their trade, we have been informed by them, for example, of one 17th century Bahra named Abdul Ghaffar of Surat, whose fleet of some 18 ships plied the Indian Ocean, outdoing the English East India Company ships at the time in supplying the Yemen with Indian cloth and transporting from Yemen coffee to Mecca, where it was purchased by pilgrims and Ottoman officials for consumption in their heartlands. Ashim Dasgupta in particular traced the history of 3 generations of Abdul Ghaffar's family in British and Dutch archives to discover not only the extent of their wealth and activities in the Indian Ocean, but also to observe that even after the entry of Europeans into the Indian Ocean, Indian merchants like Abdul Ghaffar leveraged their access to workshops in the Indian interior and their services in supplying certain commodities to the court of the early modern period, of the early modern Indian Empire of the Mughals. So Abdul Ghaffar and Bahra merchants became very active intermediaries in the Indian Ocean trade, supplying the Middle East with commodities produced in India and supplying the Indian Mughal state with commodities from further afield produced in the Middle East. They competed actively with Europeans who had entered the Indian Ocean and were attempting to take it over from Muslim merchants like Abdul Ghaffar. Nevertheless, Ashim Dasgupta traces the story of 3 generations of Abdul Ghafar's family in British and Dutch archives to discover not only the extent of their wealth and activities in the Indian Ocean, but also to observe that even after the entry of Europeans there, Indian merchants like Abdul Ghaffar leveraged their access to the Indian interior and their services in supplying commodities to the Mughals to maintain their presence, active presence, in the Indian Ocean until the mid-18th century. This is also echoed in transcripts of, for example, Mughal decrees issued in the time of Humayun, which likewise note the services of the Bahra community in supporting the emperor and the Mughal state. So you have the text of a farman issued in 1541 by Humayun, which guarantees safe passage and freedom from certain taxes to Bahra merchants in return for the favors that they have done the Mughal emperor when he was facing instability and hostility from competitor regimes in the Indian subcontinent. The rise of European companies in India and the Indian Ocean trade from the 16th century, however, began to change the relationship slowly between the Bahra and other Indian merchants from one of competition with Europeans to one of codependence, leading to petitions on the part of these merchants to European companies for protection. India Office records contain references to Bahra merchants from Surat petitioning, which is a port city in Gujarat, petitioning the East India Company officials in the late 1790s and again in the early 1800s for military escort on their voyages from India to Mocha port in Yemen worried that their goods would be confiscated on arrival in Yemen by the Ottoman official there. We also have another notice from 1831 regarding the turning over of effects of a Bahra merchant who died in Amman to his heirs. The relationship of codependence was most fulsomely expressed in a declaration of the 42nd Dai, or head of the Bahra community, Yusuf Najmuddin, who in 1795 said, "I have ever considered myself under the protection of the flag of the Honorable English Company and their protection of my life and property." By the late 19th century, Bahra merchants and Dais, of course, had yet a different relationship with the new colonial British presence in India, having been fully co-opted into the colonial economy and colonial order, as reflected in the granting in 1866 of first-class sardarship, or native prince status, to the 47th Dai, or leader of the Bahra community, Abdul Qadir Najmuddin. Excuse me. Codependence has benefits, though, for the merchants of the Bahra community, as reflected in lavishly decorated homes of the wealthier among them, and the taking of studio portraits by elites within the community. So, for example, I'm so sorry, I should have perhaps thrown out this map, which shows you where in India, right, Gujarat is, and also the town of Surat, which is the center of the Bahra community, and from which merchants like Abdul Ghaffar and others traveled across the Indian Ocean to Yemen. A European portrayal of the port of Surat and the wealth generated by that trade for Bahra merchants resulted in lavishly decorated quarters of certain Indian communities in Gujarat, like this one, and also the fashion of having studio portraits taken by members of the community. Now let's go on to Arwa. The trade of Bahra and other Muslim merchants in the Indian Ocean, of course, was also accompanied by the dissemination of their faith. As is known, Islam accompanied trade beyond the limit of conquest to Southeast Asia, for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, presumably because of the usefulness of its law, and because the study of scriptures and rituals conferred the necessary abru, or reputation for integrity, that was critical to merchant success. Knowledge of Sharia facilitated trade, and knowledge of Quran and the establishing of pious endowments enhanced honor. But Bahra activity in the Indian Ocean was of a different stripe. As we know from Yemeni as well as Bahra chronicles like the Mawsumi Bahar and the Akhbar Du'at al-Akramin, the traffic between Yemen and India included that of religious scholars in search of knowledge that would enable them to be considered for offices in the dawah or simply as a matter of faith. Hussein Hamdani noted that the pursuit of religious knowledge among the Bahras was considered incumbent upon members of the community as ibadah almiya, worship of God as an intellectual pursuit, a necessary complement to ibadah amaliya, or worship as practice. Perhaps a prime example of such undertakings is Hassan bin Nuh al-Baharuchi, author of a 7-volume work called the Kitab al-Azhar. Because of a desire to pursue knowledge, he left his home in India and went to Yemen in 1498 to study under a Yemeni Dai at the time. Al-Baharuchi discusses his progress in the first volume of the Kitab al-Azhar, saying that his education required the reading and recitation back to his teacher of 37 works in planned succession. This type of training enabled him to compile his anthology, as well as to subsequently train a future Dai, a fellow Indian, Yusuf bin Sulaiman. Among the works he lists that formed his higher education curriculum was something called the Majmu'a al-Tarbiyah, a miscellany of texts apparently originally compiled in the 12th century, in the early decades after the establishment of a Tayyibi Ismaili dawah in Yemen, and copied continuously among Bohra's or Bohra scholarly families until the late 19th century. Usually copied in 2 volumes, the Majmua appears to offer a course of study from exoteric to esoteric, as per Bohra doctrine, or from works of law and history to Neoplatonic philosophy and Gnostic works. Copies of it proliferated among Bohra families, especially by the end of the 19th century. Among the corpus of Majmua copies are those that belong to the family of Muhammad Ali al-Hamdani, originally from Yemen, whose family was established in Surat since the mid-18th century. Based on his training, he undertook conducting co-ed sessions of learning, or majalis, for members of the community, which featured the teaching of the Majmua, according to a biography written by his son. That biography informs us that Muhammad Ali's education and erudition enabled him, for example, to secure funds for a madrasa and to serve as an advisor to dais who were leading the community at the time. At the same time, the inclination toward pursuing knowledge led to his producing a kind of scrapbook of notes and excerpts that included a map of Syria, trigonometrical tables, lists of imams in the Fatimid line, bits of Sulayyid history, Gnostic diagrams, excerpts from the Bible, astrological tables, development of a cipher, notes on an 1835 edition about the physical sciences, selections of Arabic poetry, and so on, attesting to the varied interests of Bohra religious scholars that went far beyond the presumed mastery of only Quran and Hadith of their Sunni counterparts. The transmission of the 12th century Majmua al-Tarbiyah formed the pursuit of Ibada al-Miya for Baruchi and Muhammad Ali. Although neither acquired knowledge as a means of advancement to the office of Dai, their pursuit and transmission of the particular doctrine of the Bohras represented one of the more durable connections between Yemen and India, first established by the Sulayhids. While the Sulayyid dynasty did not command a fleet or charter companies, what little evidence we have indicates a keen investment on their part in maritime traffic between Yemen and Gujarat in the Indian Ocean through the framework of the Tayyibi Ismaili Dawah. That framework ensured that traffic continued beyond the death of Arwa in 1138 and the end of the Sulayyid state in Yemen with her, not only because of commerce, but also because of doctrine that promoted intellectual pursuit as a component of faith, regardless of the material or social benefits that might ensue. This is not to suggest, of course, that no other Muslim presence in the Indian Ocean was similarly animated, simply that our understanding of the dissemination of Islam in and through the Indian Ocean, including the seeking of its esoteric knowledge as well, producing, in the case of the Bohra community, a lasting connection between Yemen and India. So I wanted to just end by sharing some additional legacies of the Sulayyid period, which apparently you can find in popular culture, such as video games and fandoms. So we have, for example, books for children about Queen Arwa of Yemen. We have video games that feature the Sulayyid dynasty, replete with maps of the territories they presumably controlled. And you, too, can be personification of Arwa or some of her boon companions in this video game, for example, that's shown here. Thank you.